1920s, when people started talking about cigarettes as coffin nails and referring to smoker's cough, the public became worried that tobacco was dangerous for them.
Despite years of research, scientists continue to disagree about the alleged hazards of cigarette smoking. Whatever conclusions have been drawn thus far are largely the result of statistics, not clinical or scientific proof. Obviously, much more research is needed. The tobacco industry has granted millions for independent scientific study and will continue its support so that we may replace controversy with facts.
These were the master marketers. Cigarette people really invented many of our modern techniques of advertising.
And I've looked at an enormous library of advertisements. I'm always very tempered in my admiration for the genius. There is, in fact, exceptional genius at play.
I mean, it's like the Borg in the old Star Trek, you know, they're constantly adapting. It's very, very hard to regulate the tobacco companies because they have so much money and they're good at what they do.
The very first cigarettes are actually smoked by the Mayans going back about 1,000 years. So those go way back because cigarette really just means little cigar. Another definition of a cigarette is tobacco rolled in paper. And so actually the first European cigarettes, as opposed to the Mayan ones, were in the 17th century. And those were smoked in Spain. And those were actually just little bits of trashy cigars that had been thrown away. And the poor people would roll those up in newspapers. And so the very first cigarettes were actually just rolled trash.
The modern tobacco industry is really the confluence of 4 technological developments in the late 19th, early 20th century. The first was the cigarette manufacturing machine, the Bonsack machine.
The invention of the Bonsack machine in 1881 is probably the most important technical invention in the history of cigarettes because whereas before that time, the cigarette girls who used to roll all the cigarettes, they could only roll about 200 to 1,000 per day. But one of these machines could roll 100,000 in a day. It dramatically lowered the cost of cigarettes. So cigarettes prior to that time had really been a luxury. They'd been smoked by dandies or rich people. They were kind of an effete luxury product. But after that, they became much more of a mass market product.
The second was the invention of safety matches. Because before we had safety matches, it was very hard to light tobacco products without burning yourself. If you used the old phosphorus matches, they could have exploded. A lot of people were injured. So the development of a safe, portable way to light the cigarettes was important. The third thing was the development of mass communications.
The longtime head of the CBS network, William Paley, was on record as saying television was the greatest cigarette vending machine ever invented. And what Paley was saying was this business of television is really about selling products.
And the fourth, which went with that, was the development of modern advertising. And it was really the tobacco industry from the beginning that was at the forefront of the development of modern, innovative advertising techniques.
Art directors and writers are trying to think of concepts to sell the cigarette. And at the time, there were program developers, usually as part of the media department, that would work with the networks in conjunction with the television networks to develop programming that then they would take to the sponsor, the tobacco companies, and propose that the tobacco companies sponsored.
Camels were introduced in 1913. They took out full-page ads, the same full-page ad in newspapers all across America on the same day, the same ad. This had never been done. It was the first ever national advertising campaign, and all the ad said in the full-page ad was, "Camels are coming." And the next day, the ads all across the nation said, "Tomorrow in your city, there'll be more camels than in all Arabia." And nobody knew what camels were. And the next day it said, "Today, you can purchase Camel cigarettes at your local tobacconist. Camel cigarettes are here." They quickly captured 50% of the tobacco market in America.
Color lithography was important because it gave these cigarettes a beautiful artistic nature. There was an oriental cast to it. If you smoked cigarettes, you were sort of like traveling to the Orient. And these were four-color, beautiful, pictures with pyramids, and that's where you get things like Camel with the Eastern motif and the pyramids, or Murad or Sultan or Omar or Abdullah cigarettes. So there was an interesting pattern that whereas in the East they tried to say cigarettes were Western, in the West they tried to say they were Eastern, all of those being really trying to get the exoticism.
The advertising industry used not only psychology and not only sloganism, they used visual imagery in very compelling ways. And this began really at the turn of the century with modern color printing. Murad and Oasis and many of these early Turkish-style brands before World War I have beautiful color pictures that you can find in magazines, hundreds of different variants showing compelling scenes in just gorgeous color that persists to this day. And most magazine colors in subsequent years fade. These are just brilliant. When you look at the design of the times, in the 70s, you see oranges and avocado colors. It looks like Marimekko. It looks like the 1970s. When you go back to the 30s, the style was often referential to contemporary themes. Sometimes it was referential to colonial American themes, or to judicial themes, or political themes, or other constant truths in American life, if you would. Tobacco began with Turkish blends, very rough, like European cigarettes today. They were very rough, and if you tried to inhale them, you'd gag. Even experienced smokers would have difficulty doing that.
Turkish cigarettes, it's actually a type of tobacco. It's a very small leaf. It's called Oriental tobacco also. And it really is just a different type of leaf. And it was valued because it's sort of similar to what's called flue-cured or Virginia tobacco in the United States. It has a very low harshness. It's very mild, and so you were able to inhale it much more. And so that was blended in already beginning in the 19th century. And it's also important because in the Crimean War, you had the Russians on one side against the English and the French and the Turks. And so as a result, the Turks who'd been smoking these small, fine cigarettes, those were passed over into the English and French culture, and that's one of the ways that these Eastern cigarettes get passed over into Western Europe.
For years, the Lucky Strike brand resisted changing their colors. They wanted to because they felt they were pretty ugly, but they had so many millions of dollars in advertising that they didn't feel they could do that. However, the opportunity presented itself in World War II. They made up the story that the green color in the Lucky Strike packs was a critical war material. Of copper went into the green color. Well, in fact, there was nothing of the sort. But you then have an advertising pane, Lucky Strikes go to war.
The industry very early on starts collaborating with Hollywood, getting contracts with movie stars to get them appear in tobacco ads, and there actually are joint announcements of a new movie and a new cigarette, and these are sort of timed to go with each other.
And it wasn't product placement like we came to learn it later, it was cross-promotion.
Tobacco ads many, many times, hundreds if not thousands, had movie stars on the front. And a week or two before the movie came out, the advertisement with the star, all of the major stars, John Wayne, Joan Crawford, many of them would show up in the magazines holding a cigarette.
What would happen is that the movie stars would plug the cigarettes, and then the tobacco companies in their advertising would plug the movies. The value of the plugs of the films in tobacco ads was probably more money than the studios were themselves spending on direct advertising. The tobacco companies were working hand in glove with the emerging motion picture industry from the beginnings in the late 20s.
In any given year, a particular studio would affiliate with a tobacco company, and so that as that star's movie came out, they would appear as an endorser, saying, I smoke only Chesterfields, or I smoke only Old Gold, or I smoke only Lucky, because that was the affiliation with the movie theater. So You'll find, for example, Jack Webb, 5 different brands. Ronald Reagan appeared as a young man, in middle age, appeared in cigar campaign, which is wonderful because in the cigar campaign, if you look at the little side, it says, now appearing in bedtime for Bonzo, is when he pushed the cigars. And he was not alone. I don't mean to pick on Ronald Reagan because virtually every star appeared to the point where you can almost count on one hand those stars in the 30s and 40s, the classical era of cinema, who didn't.
The first baseball cards were invented by the tobacco industry as package stiffeners.
These were crumbly cigarettes, and they were kind of soft, and so they put these cardboard inserts in, and as a result, they were able to stiffen up the pack and keep it safe. They realized that they could put all kinds of images on. They could put images of baseball stars, naked ladies, politicians, great generals of the world. Later in Nazi Germany, it was Adolf Hitler pictures. All kinds of imagery were put on these, and people collected them. And the idea was that you should collect a whole series. And this was simply a way to get people to buy a certain brand of cigarettes and to stick to it.
Keep them coming back to your brand. That's the game.
It promoted athleticism as well. If they could do baseball, they could do other sports.
Baseball players, football players, boxers were endorsers because if they're athletic, there were even slogans built around athleticism. For example, they'll never get your wind, smoke as much as you want. Marathon runners, sprinters, they don't get your wind, and people bought it.
Or the ad agency for U.S. tobacco said, wait a minute, how are we going to popularize chewing tobacco? They started paying baseball players a lot of money to have that round can of chew in their back pocket. And as they swaggered across the field, the kids saw that round can, that round image in the back pocket, and they all started dipping.
After the tobacco companies were off broadcast television and radio, they did 2 things. One was they shifted into promotions, sponsoring advertising in baseball stadia, sponsoring car races, things like that.
Sports was using tobacco as much as tobacco was using sports. The sporting companies would get paid a lot. The tobacco industry was sponsoring whole baseball teams. Some of them were actually called just by the brand name, by the mottos of the companies, like the Chesterfield Satisfiers. They got the whole team of the Yankees to go on the baseball tour, cigarette selling tour for them. So they were able to use all these techniques in different ways.
Doctors in the early part of the 20th century were highly prestigious. Even though doctors could not do a fraction of what they can do today with drugs and surgery, they were taken as a great act of honor and faith. People trusted their physician, very much more so than they do today. And when the tobacco industry became worried that the public perception was that tobacco was unhealthful, what better way to reassure them than to put the image of a smiling and benign doctor on a cigarette ad, or even on the package of cigarettes.
Some of the tobacco ads implied that smoking was safe or even healthy. More doctors recommend Camel cigarettes than any other brand, said one.
Those advertisements, More Doctors Smoke Camels, appeared in the Journal of the American Medical Association and in medical journals all over America. And in fact, the cigarette companies would sponsor hospitality booths at the medical conventions.
Later, we saw low tar and light come into play, implying that the low tar and light brands were safer.
The real kind of modern public awareness of the tobacco issue came in the early 50s with an article in the Reader's Digest called Cancer by the Carton. At that time, Reader's Digest was the leading, most widely read magazine in the world, and they had a major article about this early epidemiological and mouse skin painting research saying smoking caused cancer. There was a broad wave of public concern about this. There were calls at the local level to ban cigarettes, cigarette advertising, to severely restrict the sale of cigarettes, warning labels, all kinds of stuff.
The industry responds by trying to say, okay, there's no proof, it's hazardous, but just in case, we'll provide you with these filters and these low-tar cigarettes.
And the way the industry responded politically was in 2 ways. One was they formed what came to be called the Tobacco Institute, to handle its political dealings in Washington, and they created something that came to be called the Council for Tobacco Research, where they said, when they ran a big advertising campaign about it, where they ran an ad called the Frank Statement ad that was published in every major newspaper and magazine in the country, where the industry said that the health of our customers is our paramount concern, and we're creating this independent research body to get to the bottom of the smoking and health controversy.
So they moved into more subtle, indirect forms of advertising, where they would say, we've got a lot of filters, or our cigarette filters best. They would never say what it filters out. They would just say it filters best, or they would say it takes the you-know-what out of smoking, and you're left to say, well, what do I know?
Now, filters actually began in the mid-1930s, and for somewhat of a reason that was different than you might think. They were kind of like portable cigarette holders, which became very popular. Famously, FDR always had a long cigarette holder that he very proudly spouted. You can see him on the front of many magazines in that kind of a pose. The normal non-filtered cigarette, when a woman smoked it, frequently little crumbles of the tobacco fell in the mouth, and people were constantly going, and their advertisements showing, literally, you'll no longer have the PFFT if you smoke this filter brand.
But this was a big battle to capture what they called the reassurance market, or the health smoker market. People were afraid of dying from cigarettes. The industry was offering these low tars in this tar war to reassure the public that smoking was safe.
The cigarette companies, because of the initial concern over the tar level and giving this implied message that if we're delivering less tar, we're somehow safer, and people were getting worried about it. And so they got into really heavily advertising. We have the lowest tar, we have the lowest levels, and the implied message being we're the safest.
A very famous filter, which began in the 50s, was the much-touted Kent Micronite filter. And they would say that only smart people smoke this. More scientists and educators smoke Kent than any other brand. And they had all these different professions. Well, I don't know how smart they were, because the Kent filter was made of asbestos.
The industry started identifying what they called target segments. So they would target females in a certain way, and they would design cigarettes for females that would have a red that they could cover up their lipstick with, or they would be long and slim to sort of make it seem like you could stay thin with a cigarette.
The history of women smoking is very interesting. Prior to World War I, the only women who smoked were prostitutes. It was almost the signature of the prostitution trade to see a woman standing outside with a cigarette in her hand. Women began covertly smoking at home, in the early part of the century, when cigarettes became more and more popular because of advances in manufacturing, and men began to smoke more and more, both at home, in the workplace, and out and around. But it was considered absolutely unacceptable for women to smoke outside. If a reputable, polite woman just did not smoke in public. And the industry understood it had a problem, because 50% of their potential consumer base were not available to them. So they were not dumb. They realized it was very important to entice women to smoke. But they didn't advertise directly at women. World War I came around, and during the wars, which were a great accelerant of tobacco use, because women took on man's roles. And when they took on man's roles, they began to feel comfortable exercising what were then considered to be man's habits. So smoking became more prominent in World War I, but still impolite to do in public. Now, this is a fascinating story. Beginning in the mid-1920s, advertising, which had never, ever targeted women. You did not see a woman holding a cigarette almost ever in tobacco advertising. The very beginning was 1926 with the Chesterfield brand, and it was an advertising that said, "Blow some my way." And it showed a woman next to a smoking man saying, "Blow it over here, give me some of that." And it was the woman was longing to smoke as the man smoked.
In the 20s, they began using women, beautiful women. It was to target a new market where there smoking levels weren't as high.
If you go back into the early part of the 20th century, it was considered rude to smoke in a restaurant. You know, you just didn't do it. And one of Bernays' ideas, again, to appeal to women, was to present the cigarette as an alternative to a sweet at the end of a meal. And so he went to leading restaurants in New York and in Paris and other places, and whereas at the end of a meal they used to bring out a dessert tray, they would bring out a tray of cigarettes. So this whole idea that smoking is associated with dining was the result of a public relations campaign run for American tobacco by Edward Bernays.
Now, that was in 1927. It was right at the very beginning of targeting women. And you know what put an end to the campaign, Reach for Lucky instead of a sweet? The candy industry.
They were competing with chewing gum and hard candy, you know, and mints and stuff like that.
Well, the candy industry was furious about this. And in fact, senators from sugar beet states, Reed Smoot famously, got up in Congress and decried the tobacco industry for saying that it was better than sweets. And so they had to stop that advertising campaign because they were going to ban cigarettes from the Schraft stores and from the candy stores, which would have hurt their marketing. Oh, you can only go so far to change culture in advertising. So a brilliant man, Bernays, who was the father of public relations, worked together with the head of the Lucky Strike brand, American Tobacco, and decided that they had to change American culture. They had to make it culturally acceptable for women to smoke outdoors.
Edward Bernays came up with the idea of getting women to march in the Easter Day parade in New York in green, because that was the color of Lucky Strike at the time.
They got a bunch of suffragettes who were protesting for women's rights and the vote and independence. And they had them carry their torches of freedom down Fifth Avenue in New York. Now, this was carried, and I can tell you, I've seen the articles, all over the United States. Now, of course, Bernays and his group helped to push that forward and helped to popularize that across, through publicity, through newspapers across the United States. Within a year, it became acceptable for women to smoke out of doors, not through advertising, but through changing culture. The first woman's cigarette, you'll never believe this because people are very surprised to hear this, was the Marlboro brand. Marlboro brand was, in fact, an elegant woman's cigarette, launched, I believe, in 1927. And its slogans were, "Ivory tips to protect the lips." And you always had these very elegant women in repose holding the cigarette very fashionably. Even today, they continue to target women, especially young women, with pink cigarettes, Camel No. 9s, Dress to the Nine, Cloud 9, you know, and it's designed to get young girls to find smoking to be attractive. We all know about the Marlboro Man. Now, in 1954, at that point, the rather lackluster Marlboro brand as a woman's cigarette turned in one day in a Chicago advertising executive's office, underwent a sex change, and become the Marlboro Man we know today. The hirsute, masculine cowboy. Same rolled up piece of paper surrounding tobacco. Elasticity of meaning, feminine beauty or masculine virulence. This is elasticity of meaning. And you see this over and over in tobacco advertising. It is brilliant. The same product means different things to different people.
They had the tough guys cigarettes for the guys with tattoos and the sailors. They had the intellectual cigarettes, which were cigarettes that would appeal to scientists. The whole history of different groups being targeted is very interesting because you have the imagery of the American Indian, your tobacco Indian sort of cigar store. You had early advertisements that say our cigarettes are clean, they're not made by dirty Japs or Chinamen. African Americans start being targeted in the 1950s, and there's actually a struggle over this in the different companies because Philip Morris, which was called the nigger cigarette, because they were selling to African Americans and they were supporting the Negro League, and they ended up actually being boycotted by the Ku Klux Klan. Basically, these companies were able to pull any kind of emotional string that you could think of. Whenever they saw an opening, they would sort of charge in if it was women or if it was African American, the gay market and lesbian market. They were highly opportunistic.